Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, a damning report from the United Nations reveals that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. The warning has been described as a code red for humanity. I'll be discussing the findings with the Global Director of CDP Worldwide, Pietro Battazzi, who will be joining me from Amsterdam, and NJ Ayuk, the Executive Chairman of the African Energy Chamber, will be joining me from Johannesburg to provide the African perspective. And regulatory challenges and poor infrastructure are just two of the various stumbling blocks preventing significant investments into Africa's private education sector. Sadeep Lad, the Managing Director and Partner at LEK Consulting, will be joining me from Bombay to discuss emerging insights from the group's latest report. Then later, I'll be looking back on the biggest company stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with business news from here in the UK, where Downing Street confirmed it had no plans to cut the pay of civil servants who refused to return to the office. It comes after one unnamed cabinet minister told the press that officials who did not return to the office should have their pay reduced. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said the government was seeking to encourage the gradual return of officials to their desks, adding that there are no plans to cut the pay for those who refuse. In other British business news, documents leaked to the BBC have revealed that former British Prime Minister David Cameron was paid £7.2 million by failed finance firm Greensill Capital before it went bust in March. In 2019, Cameron made over £3 million from cashing in shares while earning a salary of almost £1 million per year working as a part-time advisor. A spokesman for the former Conservative Party leader said Mr Cameron's finances were a private matter and he did not receive anything like the figures quoted in the BBC Panorama programme. During his time in the role, the former leader lobbied the government to allow the firm access to its coronavirus loan schemes, texting Chancellor Rishi Sunak, a Bank of England governor, as well as one of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's most senior advisors. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, putting it mildly, it's been a disastrous week for the former Prime Minister, hasn't it?
Yeah, it hasn't been a good few weeks, really. Things have been rumbling on for a while. I'll just draw your attention to a former Labour MP called Dennis Skinner, who in 2016 was kicked out of Parliament for using the term dodgy Dave to refer to the then Prime Minister. That's unparliamentary language, you're supposed to say, my right honourable. And he said it twice, dodgy Dave, and he's talking about various dealings that he thought was around. And dodgy Dave has been trending on social media for exactly these reasons. So there are two scandals at the moment surrounding David Cameron. The first surrounds Greensill Capital, which is this investment firm that went bust a couple of months ago, with all of their investors losing sort of billions of pounds in it. And it emerged in the last few days that he made $10 million, £7 million, from his role as a sort of advisor to this company. And this is the first time we've heard of how much money he made. He was only there part-time. He wasn't, officially employed there. And a lot of questions are asked because he spoke to Rishi Sunak via text message, trying to lobbying him to get as much loan capital to that company that was obviously in financial trouble as possible. It's emerged that after it was revealed, he texted the Chancellor asking them to get loans. Greensill then went bust. David Cameron's spokesperson saying he acted in good faith, there was no wrongdoing, adding he had no idea until December 2020 that Greensill Capital was in danger of failing. But there's a lot of questions about his kind of judgment and also the amount of power that former prime ministers have or MPs have. One rule for us, one rule for them. And then it's now emerged that Illumina, which is this American-US biotech company, secured a £123 million contract after David Cameron lobbied Matt Hancock, obviously the former health secretary, to go. He lobbied him to go to a conference in 2019. He went to that conference, and then a few days later, they get this huge contract. So the whole episode really is quite unedifying. David Cameron, I don't think legally has done anything wrong, but it just shows that if you're privileged, you have friends in high places, you can get stuff done. And there's this mantra that the current government and Boris Johnson talks about levelling up. Now, a lot of people think that means pushing more money to the sort of north of England and areas that are slightly deprived or underprivileged. Well, levelling up is meaningless if this is what Tory MPs, prime ministers, are doing behind the scenes on WhatsApp messages that then get deleted so that you can't then track back and see what's been happening. And it really does look like one rule for them, one rule for us. And so I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of pressure now on David Cameron to come out and explain himself about these two cases. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are more things that come out like this, not just with David Cameron, but other former prime ministers, because it seems like there should be more rules about what you can and can't do so this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Absolutely, we'll keep our eyes on it. Thanks, Simon. Let's change gear now and focus on the frightening report released early this week by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warned that time is running out to save the planet as climate change is accelerating and intensifying. Scientists predict that the fires, floods and extreme weather seen around the world in recent months is just a foretaste of what can be expected if global heating takes hold. Human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by the Global Director of CDP Worldwide, Pietro Battazzi. He joins me from Amsterdam. Pietro Battazzi, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. We've had several climate warnings in the past, none as stark as this. Why has this recent report been taken with much more serious concern?
Thank you. Good day, everybody. You're absolutely right. It's actually, quite shocking to me that, this report is news. Science has been telling us that disastrous climate impacts are nearing and has been telling us this for many years. The world has not listened well. This latest report by the IPCC provides, what is a stark warning. Code Red for Humanity was called by the UN Secretary General Guterres. And I will say this is a wake-up call for us. If we continue at the current pace, we will hit the 2 degrees warming by 2050 and pass the 1.5 degrees by 2040. This totally breaches the ambition of what was agreed in Paris in 2015. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change now when we are only at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And this is, what I think, makes the difference in this report is that, now for many people, climate change is no longer seems a distant reality, but it's something that, is happening right now. In the last few weeks, we've seen terrifying wildfires, flooding, and some of the hottest temperature on record. For the most vulnerable population, some effects of climate change are already back then. This report at the moment, sounds the alarm bell as well on the possibility of irreversible changes to the climate, the change that are linked to the changes of the nature. Those irreversible changes are sometimes called often called the tipping points. And that means that, once we pass them, it's almost impossible to go back.
Absolutely. Sorry to interject there, Pietro, and thank you for that overview there. And I suppose it is the tipping point that is concerning and frightening most people. You mentioned some of the freak weather news stories that are taking place across the world. Last year, there were the serious fires in Australia. This week, there are reports of major fires in Algeria, of all places, as well as the fire, the flooding that we're seeing. The report obviously has multiple layers of evidence, and again, we've got lots happening around the world. Is this enough for climate change deniers who, by all means are not freaks? Some of them are world leaders, but do you think now that it is the reckoning point?
Scientists usually are quite cautious in the language of certainty that they use. But in this report, they were very clear, very certain. IPCC said, that it is unequivocal that climate crisis has been caused by human activities and is affecting every corner of the planet, land, atmosphere, sea already. Science is united. And I believe that, climate change we are already observing is clearly man-made, and there's no time for any further delay of action.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. A pretty stark warning there. Pietro Battazzi, a Global Director at CDP Worldwide. Thanks so much for joining me on Channels Business Global.
Thank you.
Well, let's continue this discussion by honing in on what those warnings mean for Africa. The continent has already warmed by more than 1 degree Celsius since 1901. NJ Ayuk, the Executive Chairman of the African Energy Chamber, joins me now from Johannesburg. NJ Ayuk, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. We've had a stark warning, so I'll ask you a stark question. Has Africa been cropped out of the climate change debate?
Thank you for having me on your channel. I think Africa has been cropped out of the climate debate. African leaders are not engaged on this debate as they should be. Africa is one of the continents that is going to be hurt the most when it comes to the climate issue. Africa is going to lose a lot of money, a lot of current money coming in from oil and gas and coal. Africa still is going to have to deal with some of the climate issues, whether on the environment, agriculture, but the debate is being shifted into Western countries, and it is not being dealt with in Africa, and really having African voices and African opinions being heard on this debate that is going to affect us the most. They are just telling us what they want us to do. I think it makes sense when you ask Africans, what do you want?
Absolutely. I know you're familiar with a lot of the big names in oil and gas. And thank you for mentioning heads of states, because I did want to ask, is this being discussed around boardrooms? I'm here in London and you can't, go anywhere without anybody talking about the climate emergency and the transition. We've had the big oil tycoons saying, they're transitioning. Are you hearing this? Is the warning that we heard earlier this week being taken seriously on the continent?
I think it's not being taken seriously in the continent as of now. We are not seeing that fierce urgency of now. We've not been properly educated by what's going on. We think when you talk about climate change, people are thinking, well, maybe it's not going to snow too much in Norway, so that's not an issue. But we're not understanding that for the most part, African states, we are being affected. Agricultural bases around Zimbabwe, north of Mali, are being affected by the climate. We have to deal with that. Water, we have to deal with that. But also, our economies, when you look at shutting down oil and gas, when you look at taking out coal, how are we going to prevent some kind of austerity from happening? How are we going to ensure stability from happening? I mean, our generation is tired of having wars all the time because of resources. How are we going to engage this shift? But also, we have to get back to the fundamental question. Africa has emitted just under 2% of what the developed world has done. Europe as a whole has done 20 times more than Africa. The United States, 25 times more than Africa. China and India, even more. But right now, the question is, after all this damage has been done, and they have done an amazing things with driving technologies and built their economies, and something which we all appreciate. But then we've been the victims of that. And then at this moment, when it's just time for Africa to take off, we stand in a position where we're being told, you have to repair the earth. You have to stop your resources. You have to back out, and you have to pay reparations to those who use your resources to build their economy. There's something fundamentally unfair with that.
Thank you so much. NJ Ayuk, the Executive Chairman at the African Energy Chamber. Thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Coming up on Channels Business Global, I'll be discussing emerging insights about investment into Africa's private education sector with Sudeep Lad, the Managing Director and Partner at LEK Consulting. He'll be joining me from Bombay. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking with Sudeep Ladd, the Managing Director and Partner at LEK Consulting. But before then, here's some company news for you. Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Atlantic airline is eyeing a London listing as it seeks to recover from the coronavirus-induced crisis in the aviation industry. Investment banks Barclays and Citi have been hired to advise the board. The potential flotation on the London Stock Exchange could take place within the next 2 months if the plan is successful. The airline is hoping for a rebound in international travel, particularly on its lucrative route between New York and London. Flights to America accounted for over half of its £2.9 billion revenues posted in 2019. US Labour Department data shows that there were a record 10.1 million job openings posted by US employers in June as the economy continues to bounce back from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a 590,000 jump from the previous month, well above economists' expectations. A lack of affordable childcare, generous unemployment benefits and career changes have all been cited as reasons for the shortfall. Hiring is expected to pick up in September when schools reopen and states begin phasing out emergency unemployment benefits. The Chinese short video platform TikTok has overtaken Facebook to emerge as the world's most downloaded app in 2020. Facebook-owned apps have held the top spot since the survey began in 2018. The app's popularity grew during the pandemic when it became the leading download in Europe, South America and in the US. Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook-owned apps accounted for the rest of the top 5, with WhatsApp, Instagram and Facebook Messenger all making an appearance. Now to our next story. According to research conducted by LEK Consulting, regulatory challenges and poor infrastructure are just 2 of the various stumbling blocks preventing significant investments into Africa's private education sector. Quality education for children across the world has been significantly impacted due to the coronavirus crisis, particularly on the continent. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Sudeep Ladd, who is a partner and managing director at LEK Consulting. He joins me from Bombay. Sudeep Ladd, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Goodness, it's been quite a long while since we last spoke. And of course, nobody had heard of COVID-19 at that time. How has private sector investment post and during the pandemic changed some of your findings in terms of emerging trends?
Hi, Juliana. First of all, thank you for having me on your show, and good to be speaking to you and to all your viewers out there. Clearly this has been said time and again that we are living in unprecedented times. We continue to be as bullish, in terms of the demand for education. And the reason, if you look at the continent, Juliana, which is probably the topic of discussion, is that, only 15% of the total relevant age group population in Africa has some form of tertiary education, if we talk about higher education, right? And just consider this number, right? Contrast this with what we see in developed markets, which is close to 60, 70%, right? Even in emerging markets, India and China, we are talking about 30 to 40% of gross enrollment ratios. So having said that, COVID has been a blip in the overall trend, but nonetheless, the long-term demand pointers remain as solid as they were before.
Absolutely. EdTech, a term who would have thought would have been a massive term as well as lockdown in 2020 and 2021, but it has been a lifesaver. It's been a lifesaver for the global north and in parts of the global south. And in terms of investment, is the interest for Africa still there, considering that we know, network accessibility is a major cause for concern in Africa?
Yeah, that's right. Infrastructure has been a constraint, but actually infrastructure is sort of, there have been investments going into infrastructure. You're seeing a lot of venture capital, private equity money going into creating that part of the ecosystem. But then there were other challenges, right? You have regulations, but the good news is that even regulations are changing for good, right? You're seeing governments taking that remote delivery is actually something that could work, right? And what we have noticed is that there's a lot of contrast between various countries in Africa, right? On one hand, you have South Africa, where about 40% of total higher education enrollments are in distance education, right? And which means that the ecosystem is in place for remote education. While similarly, when we talk about North Africa, the numbers are low, but interestingly, governments in Morocco and other parts of North Africa have been more forthcoming and in allowing online education as a viable mode of education. And then obviously, one constraint that remains for bulge bracket investors who have capital to deploy globally is that the lack of scalable assets or scale assets in Africa. But clearly the direction of travel is in the positive direction, and we will see that Africa need not go into attaining the brick and mortar higher education first and then moving to online. In fact, there could be some amount of leapfrogging, if you will, that would come in. And in fact, what we are seeing is that a lot of could also come from the continent in terms of delivering affordable quality education.
Absolutely. I know that LEK Consulting have conducted some significant research into your latest report, and I want you to talk about some of the findings from that. You mentioned South Africa being a bright spot. Where else are you seeing a significant growth, and where is this money coming from?
Sure. I mean, these are all private pay kind of models. So in education, a lot of growth we are seeing is that the basis remains the same, that that it's about increasing your return on investment, or in other words, having outcomes which are linked to employability. And so as a result, I mean, a lot of higher education that you see is in the private side is all private pay. And we are seeing, we are seeing a lot of activity as you talk about where is this money coming from. So there are various types of actors which are active in the market, right? You have big higher education companies, right? In the continent, you have Edvitech, Stadio are some of the listed providers who are expanding provision, not just locally, but looking at opportunities outside of Africa. You also have global investors and operators, right? So European-based operators find a very strong connection with what happens in Africa, and you are seeing some leading regional higher education platforms in the European context, like Galileo, are sort of increasingly looking at opportunities. You also have British universities. So University of Lancaster has a campus in Ghana, and that's an example of expanding provision from UK to let's say Africa. And then on top of this, you have private equity, venture capital money, which is finding the right pockets and within the right ticket sizes of investments to go into.
Absolutely. We also just last week had the huge global education summit where I believe $5 billion was pledged to go towards education in Africa. Before I let you go, Sudeep, I've got to ask you a billion rupee question, which is, what is your outlook for 2022 and beyond? Very briefly, please, Sudeep.
Yeah, I think 2022 from a demand side, the outlook remains positive, right? You will see, the landscape is shifting. So from a supply side, you will need to see where that demand will go, right? For example, will students continue to go to premium universities where they are paying, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 or upwards of money for their annual tuition, or they will rather opt for, these remote models, which are more efficient, probably cost effective, and also gets you to the employment market quicker. So you will see those new age models getting more prominence as we go along, and universities will need to up their game, which they can very much do, but they will have to come out of the traditional ways of some of the brick and mortar education to suit to the need of the consumer as we go along.
Absolutely, and that's true not just for Africa but for the entire world. Sudeep Ladd, Managing Director and Partner at LEK Consulting. Thank you so much for the really crucial insights there. Thank you, Sudeep. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.